Welcome, friends. We've made it to one of the trifecta chapters that I have teased out for a long time in this series. You've been with us. Welcome to The Forest and the Trees. My name is Jeremy, and I'm joined, as usual, by my friend Jeff.
Where's my pig? Did you see Pig, Jeremy? Have you watched it yet?
I still have it. You're making me look bad here. I still haven't seen. Is this another quote from that movie?
It's in the trailer. Did you even watch the trailer?
I didn't.
Jeremy, do you know how many hours of audiobooks I've gone through based on your recommendations? This is starting to feel a little bit one-sided at this point.
It is.
Pig is a 90-minute movie.
You know, to my defense, I have more children than you do. So we're here to talk about a fantastic chapter of the Bible. What I have said is just so underrated, so good. This chapter is so good. Today we're going to explore whether Christianity has become a villain, explore the role of prophecy and spiritual gifts today, and what it means for Jesus to be nonviolent. Now I'd like to set the tone with verse 12. It's beautiful. It says, "Rejoice in our confident hope. Be patient in trouble and keep on praying." So Jeff, rejoice in our confident hope. Be patient and keep on praying.
All right, you've convinced me. I'll keep on.
That was for you.
Still waiting, living on a prayer.
Yeah. But you got to have that confident hope, Jeff.
Okay, yeah. I'll have to work on that one for sure.
Okay.
I think I have a lot of patience. I don't know. I've been waiting 32 years. I'll keep waiting. Why not?
I think you're pretty patient.
Oh, thanks. Patiently waiting for you to watch at least one of my movie recommendations.
You're not very patient about that. I will just throw that out there.
It's been 10 weeks. It's been so long.
Yeah. I need more time.
Yeah. No, well, you're giving me the opportunity to stretch my patience.
There you go. You can practice patience with me.
Yeah, this is like patience CrossFit for me. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I love this chapter too, Jeremy. This is a very refreshing, beautiful, uplifting chapter. I think there's great stuff in here for everyone. You got humility, teamwork, generosity, having a solid work ethic, loving your enemies, nonviolence, just great stuff all around. And we have an iconic verse right from the start in verse 2. It says, "Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is his good and pleasing and perfect will." Also, just want to point out the NIV version is the really famous turn of phrase that I always remembered, like from memorizing this as a kid, was "be transformed by the renewing of your mind." I think that's the way I always remember this verse being said, but changing the way you think is less poetic, but it's a little bit more direct, and it's an interesting way to think about it.
That isn't a problem though. Like most of the verses I've memorized in NIV. Mm-hmm. So I have to if I'm looking it up for the podcast, it'll be in NLT and it won't pull up. And I'm like, dang it. So I'll have to go switch it to NIV, find my verse I'm thinking of, because that's the phraseology I know, and then retranslate it. Which is just kind of a funny thing if you're a Christian or I guess anybody who studies the Bible, and you try to memorize it, whatever version you pick has consequences. Choose wisely.
Yeah. And with Romans in particular, because you got the Romans Road and just like so many verses that I remember like memorizing for Awana when I was a little kid. If our listeners know what that is.
Wow. Yeah.
I did. Yeah. That's why I'm not ashamed, because I'm an approved workman. Maybe you can help me change the way I think here, Jeremy.
Okay. See what we can do.
So, okay, this whole idea of like non-conformity, this is like going back to the 90s kids thing. I remember the "Not of This World" t-shirts. Do you remember those, Jeremy?
I do.
And I think this is a theme that runs very deeply throughout Christian culture and throughout the Bible, the idea of not being like transformed by the way that this world is. Don't let the world affect you. Oftentimes it manifests in sort of an us versus them mentality of like, we here in the church are doing things right and the ways of the world are evil. They're sneaking woke agendas into their Disney movies, for example. It's worth noting that, like, within context, right, the church in Rome that Paul is writing to is more of an oppressed minority, but throughout the past 2,000 years, Christianity has become much more popular. And especially here in America, Christianity is still the majority worldview. So I don't know, it kind of made me think, like, what does that actually mean, like, for Christians to not be affected by the ways of the world? Because Christians have so much cultural capital in the world, especially in our own context here in America.
Mhm.
It reminded me a little bit of a quote from Harvey Dent from The Dark Knight.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
I think this can resonate a lot with the history of the church and the way that they used to be this small oppressed minority, and many times throughout history they've become a violent oppressor. Today, culturally, it depends on who you ask, but a lot of people would say that the Christian moral majority is currently, like, trying to strip the rights off away from people, and it's sort of this sad, ironic twist in my view. But I wonder what you think about that, Jeremy. Do you think by demonizing the ways of the world, Christianity has become the villain?
It's a great question. I think the us versus them mentality can be very problematic, and the way it often gets used by Christians, I think, becomes very problematic. When Christianity focuses itself on we are the victim of culture, I would say it usually goes really bad. And that's, a lot of the worst expressions you see is when a Christian or a group of Christians, are become convinced, like, it's us versus these guys, and these guys are oppressing us, and we've got to fight back. And truthfully, I would say this is what Trump played into with his campaign. This idea of appealing to Christians of, I'll fight for you, I'll make things right, I'll get back, the influence that you once had as the church. And that was really appealing to a lot of people. Like, yeah, we need that. And I think it was because of this. We are the victims. We used to have all this power. Now we don't. We used to have all this influence. Now we don't. And I think that it's a problematic way to see the world, because it invites you into, seeing yourself as a victim. I would suggest it's far better. We should be a beautiful anomaly as the church, not an angry majority. And yet oftentimes Christians want to be this loud majority. We coerce the government. We convince the government to rule the way we say. We make the laws the way we say. And this is really, a lot of the rhetoric you hear. So here's what I would say about the verse, because I don't think the problem is the verse. And I actually love this verse. I would say the problem is many Christians have not changed the way they thought. They think exactly the same way the world thinks. They just add a spiritual dynamic to what they think. So they spiritualize their own opinions, and that makes it even worse, right? So I would say the real problem is not this verse or this idea. The problem is Christians are not changing the way that they think, a lot of them. And where this is most painfully obvious to me is when I hear Christians argue for Christian nationalism in the US. It's like you are literally just mainstream taking this rhetoric of the world, adding in this flavoring to make it sound like it's godly, and it's disgusting. It's not of Jesus. It turns into white supremacy and patriarchy and all these other things that are not of Jesus. And yet it can sound so good the way that they pitch it. But I would say that what they end up doing is, I'm going to add a spiritual justification to their opinions, which makes, opinions of the world that much worse. And, it's been said, like, you're never more dangerous than when you think you're defending God, because you have this moral mandate to what you're doing that all of a sudden, any ends justify the means if it's a holy enough pursuit. And I just think that is a recipe for a lot of bad stuff. And so I would say, to a Christian, hey, actually, let's focus on changing the way we think. Like, not just us versus the world, but like, how do we actually think differently than the world? And as we're going to get into some of the stuff that Jesus taught, it's not coercive and, we're going to have more power, more control. It's the opposite of that. And if we don't see that, it's because we haven't actually changed the way we think.
It's kind of hard to know, like, who should be changing the way that they think, right? Because I can see why Christians would embrace this and think, I don't need to change the way I think because I was brought up Christian, so I already have the correct worldview. Do you know what I mean? And they would say like maybe like big picture, like the world has changed the way it thinks because the world has gone from Christianity being a small minority to being this massive world religion.
I suppose it depends on how you frame it. Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
To me, this is like a everyday thing. It's not. Hey, I was raised right, and I have the truth, and therefore, I'm just going to stand my ground. It's like, no, every day I need to wake up and go, Jesus, change the way I think today to be more like the way you think, and change my heart to be more like your heart today. And literally, it's like, I think I'll have that posture till the day I die, because otherwise I quickly go into, I can be just as drawn to power and influence and prestige as anyone else. And that can have its lure for me as well. So I have to constantly, even if I feel like I have, or I know the truth, I have to constantly go, God, change the way I think so that I'm not sucked into all this stuff that the world offers, which it would be easy to get sucked into.
When you were talking about Christian nationalism, I'm trying to think of like, is there a secular nationalism that you see? Like when I think about the political left, they seem to be generally much more skeptical and much more measured in their view of America. Like when I picture someone who loves America and has like the American flag boxers or whatever, like I'm usually picturing a conservative Christian, which maybe is an unfair stereotype, but I'm trying to imagine what the liberal version of that. I suppose there are some people who really, really love Joe Biden or something, but I'm hard pressed to picture someone like that.
I think there's something there. I will probably share. The people who talk far more about love of country tend to be conservative, and many of them would call themselves, devout Christians, which I think is very problematic if you're trying to live out the church and you can't see the difference between your country and patriotism, and this radically other way of thinking that Jesus is inviting us into. But yeah, I mean, I think, on both ends of it, like even if you go, okay, more the Democrat angle, which far less talk of God usually, but they still will, most of them will still say that they're Christian somehow or something, because they know to not say that you're going to lose, the Christian voters. So I think there's an element of politics on both sides of like, all right, I got to play the game enough so I don't alienate, a whole segment of people. But I just think, that to me, it's like, let the world run the world. And we'll get into some of that next week in chapter 13. Like the world's going to function. There's going to be governments, like fine. But where we somehow insert ourselves as Christians and say, okay, now we got to be at the center of this. That's where I go, whoa, time out. Why do we have to be at the center of that? Like, let the government govern, let people do that. Like that's going to happen. Right. But like, why are we feeling called to that? Why do we feel like we have to be running all of that? And, well, don't you want, the people, and I hear this all the time, don't you want the people making the laws, to be people who care about things that are, it's like, yeah, I do. Sure.
Right.
But that is so messy when you start thinking the way in which we're going to bring God's kingdom to earth is through the kingdoms of this world. And I just go, it doesn't play out well. I've read that book. I've seen that story. I have watched that movie over and over. Like it doesn't go well. It becomes like the world. And so that's where I think I would say to any Christian, now, I don't care if you've been a Christian your entire life or you're a baby Christian and all this is new to you, every day is an opportunity to change the way you think and to say, Jesus, reset me so that I'm not functioning the way that I would normally function, but through your Spirit, give me different eyes to see different things. I think that is an invitation for any Christian. And any Christian that would say no to that, like, nah, I got it, I don't need it, I would just say that seems silly to me to not expect to need to do that every day.
I suppose there's a lot of different ways to take this. Maybe I kind of took it in the political direction, but yeah, I certainly see what you're saying in terms of more of the personal in your own life direction. Like, I think you could just argue like that this is a verse for the concept of critical thinking, and like you should always challenge your assumptions and not, the thing that you believe yesterday isn't necessarily the thing you should believe tomorrow. So yeah, I mean, I like it in that that interpretation.
Well, even Jesus, would ask people like, how do you read it? Which I think is such a great question. Like, here's the verse. Yeah. How do you read it? Like, what do you think? And
Yeah.
I love the critical thinking part of it, but this is where I would say all of us would do better if we challenged our thinking every day, right? No matter if you're an atheist or a Christian or wherever on the spectrum you would say you are, like, don't we want better thinking out of all of us? So, if we're a Christian, we would say that better thing is going to come from the Holy Spirit and from, the influence of God. But if you're not a Christian, I would say, I still encourage you to like change the way you think to be better always and figure out how you can do that and pursue that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it reminds me of like kind of the idea people have of like always be learning, always be like changing the way you think in that sense. Sometimes I wonder if like is that sustainable? Like I think it's probably like the older you get, the harder it is to change things. I remember like before I turned 30, I had heard all these statistics about like once you turn 30, like you're set in who you are. And that was kind of this terrifying thought to me of like, I only have so much time to become the person I want to be. So maybe that's unfortunate that I kind of like started seriously questioning religion right before I turned 30. But whatever. Like maybe I'll just hold out for the deathbed confession, like the workers in the vineyard.
Well, if
strategy.
it makes you feel better, the being set by 30 has not remotely been true in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I am not the same guy I was when I was 30 years old. And I suspect, I'm going to keep growing. So I think there's something to it. I also was told, this makes me laugh. I was also told like, hey, as you get older, you're going to become more conservative. Just, be aware, like when you're young, the liberal ideas sound cool and you'll be drawn to it. But as you get older, you'll come around, it's kind of one of those things.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that also hasn't been true. So I don't know.
I know. Yeah. I feel similar. We're getting back into politics again, but I wonder if that is kind of a generational difference. If millennials are going to stay liberal, much to their boomer parents' dismay. Time will tell. Let's move into verse 6 here. We've got a list of some of the gifts of the Spirit. So it says, in his grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. So this is interesting. There's this whole list of gifts of the Spirit here. I just read about prophecy, but it also lists serving, teaching, encouragement, giving, leadership, and mercy. And when I think of gifts of the Spirit, I normally think of the more spooky, controversial list in First Corinthians that involves like healing and speaking in tongues and like the more charismatic stuff. I was struck by this list because it's much more kind of like corporate approved, much more safe and less controversial than the Holy Spirit type stuff. 2 through 7 in particular just seem like non-controversial like virtues that everyone could agree with. But number 1, prophecy is a little bit more of like has a supernatural element to it. And I know we've talked about prophecy before, but I was curious if you've had experience with it, because when I think about prophecy and like whether it's going to come true or not, it seems to me that prophecies are either so vague and amorphous that they're kind of undeniable, like things like horoscopes or palm readers. People can make these very vague predictions and it's like, oh, that matches my life perfectly. Or sometimes people will make very specific prophecies, like they'll say the world is going to end next Thursday, and then it's definitively proven wrong. Mm. So I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, what have you had a specific prophecy that you've seen fulfilled in your own life?
I actually have.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, this is kind of a bizarre story. Growing up, I grew up as a preacher's kid and loved the church, thought it was awesome. And I thought, I'm going to go into ministry just like, my dad, and kind of went down that road until I got into be my senior year, I think. And I was kind of like, I don't know if I want to do this. I had seen some of the ugliness of the inside of the church, as a preacher's kid. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if that's for me. I don't know if I want to do that. And so kind of changed gears a little bit and applied to ASU and was going to get a business degree. And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go make a bunch of money and go slay it in business and not do this ministry thing. And I had the student pastor of our church at the time out of the blue one day. He's like, hey, can I take you out to lunch? I'm like, sure. So we got to lunch, and I'll never forget, we were having calzones. And I don't calzone's not like a food I eat a lot, but even back then, but I just remember we were eating calzones. It's an important detail of the story. It's not important. I just remember it. So we're eating calzones, and this pastor had been trained, in his career. He'd also been trained as a improv comic. And so he was just one of those really funny people. And he's like, hey, there's something I need to tell you that I've never told you before. And I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking there's like a joke coming. And he says, yeah, I have the spiritual gift of prophecy, and I just have never told you that. And I'm like, okay, still waiting for like, what's the punchline of this joke? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, the way it works for me is God gives me something like a prophetic word to say to someone, and I may or may not understand it, but like obedience for me is to deliver the message that I feel like God has given me to the person. And I'm like, okay. And so like this whole thing, I'm like, where is this going? And he's like, and I feel like God has a message for you. I'm like, all right. And he's like, you're running from your calling. I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, yeah, you're running from your calling. Like, you're supposed to go and do this. Like, you're supposed to go into ministry. And I was like, no, that's my dad's thing. And he's like, no, it's your thing. Like, God's telling you it's your thing, and you're running from it. And if you run from it, here's how this is going to go play out. And so he literally sets out this like alternate universe of, depending on the choice I make here, how this will play out. And he's like, if you go to ASU and you don't go to ministry right now, you're gonna get all the things that you want. You're gonna go be very successful in business. You're gonna go do well. You're gonna make lots of money, and all these things that you think you want right now, you're gonna get them. And I'm like, this sounds amazing. Thank you. Like, this is exactly what I want. And he's like, but you'll never be happy with that, and you're always gonna wonder what if. And so you're gonna start getting more and more involved at church as like a volunteer. And then you're going to realize that God's given you unique gifts, and a lot of those gifts can be used to serve the church. And so because you're not serving the church, you're going to be drawn into it. And then more and more, you're going to want to do that. And then eventually you're going to quit your company or whatever, and you're going to go and do this. And like lays this whole thing out. And I'm like, what? And he's like, or you can just save yourself a bunch of time and go and do what God's asking you to do right now. And I was like, okay. And so he's like, all I'm asking you to do is pray about it. I'm like, all right, I can do that. And I literally left that lunch thinking, there's no way this is true. This is bizarre. And as I prayed about it, I just got this sense of like peace. Like, yeah, that's right. Like, that's what you should be doing. Like, let's go for it. And so I ended up not going to ASU. I already had my roommates at this point, ended up totally changing gears, went into ministry. And here's interesting. I would say I felt that same call on my life in ministry until I resigned as a lead pastor in Oregon. And when I resigned, I felt this sense of God releasing me from the call I got when I was a senior in high school. Like a very clear, like, connect the dots. Like, it began here, and now I'm releasing you from this, in the sense of you don't have to spend this next season of your life in, full-time ministry the way you were. But I would say that was definitely vocationally something God wanted for me and has profoundly shaped my life. And I would say absolutely is because of a prophetic conversation someone had. So I would say that the way we often describe prophecy is not actually the way it's mostly used, even in the scriptures. It's not this fortune telling, so even the way my friend used it with me, I would say it wasn't necessarily him predicting the future. It was a prophetic word to me of like, hey, there's something that needs to be said in this moment, almost like cutting through, something like, I got to get this to you. Otherwise, you may not make this choice right now. And actually, what's been very interesting is since all that, I would say like one of the gifts that I most deeply resonate with personally is the gift of prophecy. And the way it works for me is not at all like it worked for the pastor, and it's not at all fortune telling. The way it works for me is I so clearly sense like this is what needs to be said right now, and no one else is saying it. Like, that's what it looks like for me. I'm like, you need to say this, and no one else is going to say it. And usually I know if I actually follow through on that, it's going to cost me something. Like it's going to hurt. And so this is not like a woo, so grateful for this gift. I get to, I have the gift of prophecy and, it makes me an Old Testament prophet. No, it's like this thing hurts. And I can just tell you story after story of the sense I get of like, you need to say this. And it's like, if I say this, this is going to go poorly. And, it usually does in the short term of like, people don't want to hear it. But you read the Old Testament prophets, that is how prophecy often works. Like they would tell like, hey, here's something like you need to say. And man, it didn't go well for them. And there's a book that I love that I would say strikes like something a chord with me on a soul level more than probably any other book I've ever read outside of the Bible. It's called The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann. I discovered this book in 2017. I've read it 9 times since then. Now I read it 3 times a year because I just deeply resonate with it. But I want to read a part of what he describes as the prophetic imagination because it's not the, hey, fortune telling, it's something different. Here's what Walter Brueggemann says. The task of prophetic imagination and ministry is to bring to public expression those very hopes and yearnings that have been denied so long and suppressed so deeply that we no longer know they are there. I love that way of thinking of it, is you are bringing to expression that which has been buried beneath the surface. That was that thing that people need to feel, need to think, need to express, but for whatever reason, it gets pushed down. The role of the prophet is to connect to that, to bring that out, to fan that flame and allow that message to be heard or dealt with or whatever. And so I actually love this. I do agree with you. It's totally supernatural because you can't do this without the presence of God. But this has been profound in my own ministry journey and has been profound in how I've lived out my ministry, especially since then. So curious to know how all that lands to you. Is that super bizarre to you, or what do you think?
All right. So do you have a more specific story about a fulfilled prophecy? No, seriously, thank you for sharing that. I think you've shared this story before, probably when I asked you on a different episode about what was it like when you felt called or something like that, because I remember this story. So like even when I was like asking you this question, I was thinking about there's kind of different definitions of prophecy. There's the predicting the future thing that I alluded to in my question, but there's also kind of the speaking truth to power definition of prophecy, which is more like what you're practicing now. Is that right?
Yeah.
But I suppose both of them have the element of like there's a supernatural component of like God speaking into like telling you what to say, whether that's for the future or the present. It's definitely a cool story. Obviously, it's like very personally resonant with you. It's not very satisfying in terms of like proving that prophecy is real, because basically it's like this guy convinces you to make a career change. And I can even see like the imagination element to it of like he sort of like invited you to imagine this dark future where you become like
no, it's a bright future.
Well, no, dark in the sense of
you're
like
gonna get everything you want.
Yeah, exactly. There's dark in the sense of you have you have all the money in the world, but money can't buy me love. So, versus like the path that you chose, which was the path of becoming a man of God. It's a cool story. I have not read the book, The Prophetic Imagination. I know you've brought it up multiple times, and I should read it sometime so we can talk about it, because just the idea of
Don't worry, I won't guilt you if you don't read it.
The idea of using your imagination to see what God is telling you. Like when I was a Christian, I used to think of those types of things as this really cool, deep, mysterious spiritual practice. Now as a non-believer, it seems like religion is kind of like giving itself away by saying like you have to just like imagine God is talking to you and then God talks to you. But again, I should read the book, and I'm sure he has a lot more smarter things to say than what I just said.
Well, I don't think anything in the book would convince you or change your mind on anything, because fundamentally, yeah, you either believe. If you don't believe God exists, then there will be no prophecy that would even make sense. And I think what you're asking for is there a sign, right? You're not asking for really prophecy. You're saying, prove to me that someone can predict the future and it come true, and then you can verify it. Which, I mean, maybe that's happened. I don't know. But to me, it's like
Yeah.
that's like the most base level of what prophecy could be. Of, hey, tomorrow this is going to happen, and now you're getting into how does the future happen? What is God's role in the future? How does God know the future? Which I'm very interested on. We've touched on. I think there's no way you could explain that gift because of the supernatural element where it doesn't sound weird to someone who doesn't believe in God.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like, so you're saying basically, I'm asking for a sign, like a proof, like something verifiable of like if you could make a prediction of like,
Correct.
this is going to happen tomorrow, and then that would be like a really definitive way to prove God is real, or at least prophecy is real.
But to me, like that's not the role of prophecy is like, hey, we're going to show off how good God knows the future. You know what I mean?
But I mean, it is a really important part of the story of Jesus, right? Of like multiple gospels make a point of saying this fulfilled the prophecy of like he'd be a lamb to be slaughtered and things like that. You know what I mean?
So what's interesting about that is a lot of time, in the prophecy of the Old Testament, it's God prophesying things God's going to do, right? Which is a totally different way of understanding. Like, I can prophesy things that I'm going to do tomorrow that wouldn't impress you. Like if I said, hey, tomorrow I'm going to eat lunch at noon, I'm prophesying it right now. And then I call you tomorrow and I FaceTime you at noon. I go, see, I told you I'm eating at noon, right? It's a sign. You'd go, yeah, but you prophesied what you're going to do. Like most of the prophecy you see in scripture is God prophesying, here's what I'm going to do, which is funny. Like if we did that, you wouldn't find it impressive, but we do find it impressive because it happens, right? And I would say it happens because God knows I'm going to go do that. And so that also reveals part of how God interacts with the future of like, I can say, hey, this is going to happen tomorrow with a high probability, I'm going to eat lunch at 12:15 tomorrow. And if I want it to happen that way, I can literally work my schedule around where God willing, I wake up, I can have lunch at 12. You know what I mean? Like that's not, that sign in of itself wouldn't wow you. You wouldn't go, he did it. He proved a prophecy. And so to me, like that's not what makes prophecy amazing. What makes prophecy amazing is when things get buried down and then someone with a prophetic voice is able to bring it out and bring something to the surface or speak truth to power or, like, oh yeah, we were all wondering that or thinking that. And someone was willing to say it. And then the room shifts and the dynamic shifts. And yeah, there's always going to be an atheistic explanation for this. And I think your explanation is plausible, right? He planted a seed in my imagination and there's no way to verify your point. There's no way to verify my point. So both of us, we get back to where we started, right? It doesn't prove anything either way. I just know, as I have experienced God, that resonated with me, seemed like it was valid. And again, even then you could say you were deluding yourself and I wouldn't be able to prove to you otherwise. But that's, I don't know any other way to experience God with any sense of certainty. There's always that element of mystery. And, I hope I'm always humble enough to say, yeah, maybe I got it wrong. maybe I got carried up in the moment. Sure. But the way it's played out in my life has been very interesting to watch. And I would say in my estimation adds validity to it. But again, not in a sense that would convince an atheist otherwise.
No, that's good. I guess like another way to kind of frame it is hindsight bias, because I mean, I have these thoughts all the time of like, what would have happened if I hadn't gone to this school, or like hadn't taken this job and, moved to this state instead of this state, and I think that's a very common just human feeling of like, I made a bunch of mistakes in life, but I'm so grateful for where I'm at now. So I've got to say it all worked out. So it's like everything happened for a reason.
Sure.
But, there's no way to know. Like maybe if I would have made a different decision back then, things would have been even better now.
Well, that's why I think using prophecy as a sign to prove God is probably not helpful. Like, I don't think you're going to convince anyone. Like that to me is not the role of prophecy, And so I don't think any story of prophecy you'd go, wow, now I believe. Like, I just don't think it's going to convince you if you don't already believe.
Yeah. And I guess another element is kind of like the end times prophecies. Like, I feel like that's just caused so much confusion throughout I mean, Christian culture in particular, but as humanity of like, just the fact like when Jesus says there will be wars and rumors of wars, it just seems like the most vague, like safe prediction possible. It's like, I predict in the next 100 years there will be political chaos and there's probably going to be a war or two.
Don't you
Like,
know
and
that
if,
Tim LaHaye figured all that out, Jeff?
yeah,
He
yeah.
mapped it all out. There's books. You can just read the Left Behind books and it'll answer all your questions.
I have an appreciation for the more the more mysterious flavor of the more subdued flavor of prophecy. You know, that's it seems to make more sense to me than the specific prophecies that get fulfilled.
So I'm curious as you we're reading that list, as someone who was in the church, not in the church anymore. As you look at this list, we'll just keep it to this list.
Mhm.
Do you resonate personally with any of the 7 gifts mentioned? And if yes, has there ever been a spiritual component to it? And, did that change as you changed what you believe? Or would you say, hey, these are universal enough where, I had mercy before and now I have mercy still afterward? Or, is it a personality trait, or how do you view this in your own journey with Christianity?
Yeah, that's interesting. As I was thinking about that, like, I mean, like I already said, I feel like verses 2 or list 2 through 7 are just universal, like non-controversial, like good things. Like when I was a Christian, I thought I should be serving more. Serving is a good thing. Now that I'm not anymore, I still think, yeah, serving is a good thing. I should dedicate more time to serving people. I'd say that the two that I've changed my thinking on since leaving the faith are giving and leadership. Giving, just like we talked about before, like I used to believe like very specifically it's good to be generous, but the first 10% of your income needs to go to your local church, and then any kind of charitable giving you want to do after that is the overflow. And so I've changed my thinking on that, and just like, not that there's anything wrong with giving to the church, but if I only have so much money to be generous with, I don't know that the local church is like the most efficient bang for your buck compared to other charities.
Right.
And then the other one is leadership, in that I would still say, like, generically, leadership is a good, virtuous thing. But when I think about leadership and its connection to the church, and just like my experience with the church and the way it celebrates leadership, elevates charismatic leaders who are prone to corruption, prone to let the power go to their head, and then use their leadership to abuse other people, I have a lot more icky feelings with just the way that the church tends to promote leadership as this just incredibly important thing. I mean, like, so the story of Mark Driscoll, of course, comes to mind. The whole podcast Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, I feel like, is just this classic example of someone who the church elevated this guy because they said maybe he's got some character flaws, but he's such a strong leader, and leadership is so important that we're gonna give this guy a platform. And I mean, I worked at a church that always attended the Global Leadership Summit, and that they just treated leadership like they put just the concept of leadership on this huge pedestal, as if it's such an important thing. They want to encourage everyone as a leader. And again, I think there's a way to view that positively, of like everyone's a leader, but also it had such a corporate CEO bent to it that I always felt like didn't really align with the values of Christianity. And of course, the leadership summit had its own scandal with a leader who what turned out to be abusive, and they decided to kind of just bury that story and continue on with the conference, which also bothered me. So yeah, very mixed thoughts on leadership because of my experience in the church and Christian culture.
So did you ever feel like you had one of those gifts?
One of these gifts in particular?
Yeah.
Let's see.
Like I'm saying, like, think back to like when you were a Christian. Would you have looked at this list and gone, "Oh, serving's my thing. Like that's the one God gave me."
Maybe serving was the one that was like put on my heart, because I would always think about like the idea of like, what am I doing, like working at church? Like the real ministry should be going out in the street and like helping people. Like, isn't that a more immediate response to like what Jesus is talking about most of the time? And so like maybe, I don't know, maybe that was just a kind of like guilt manifesting in my own mind, or maybe this was like the Holy Spirit like putting this burden on my heart. I don't know. I remember taking the spiritual gifts test, and the result was knowledge of the word. Was the idea that just I'm knowledgeable about the Bible and I can use that. So, I've the jokes
Look at you now.
yeah, the joke's on you because I'm turning the weapons against you, as they
That's
say.
hilarious. I do think the list is interesting. Your observation that 2 through 7 are kind of like universally accepted, I think is a very valid observation and is an interesting thought to me. It reminds me of like, when like companies come up with their core values and they're like the most obvious, like,
Yeah, exactly.
like no company would ever disagree with that value. You know what I mean? Like that can't be really what makes you unique. Like that is a universal, like some of these do kind of feel, a little bit like that, with the exception of prophecy, I think, on this list. But
And
I think it would be interesting to me if I ever was in your shoes and I was like, yeah, I don't believe this anymore, to then make sense of the prophecy thing would be like, okay, so does that just go away? And that was never, I think you'd have to conclude it was never real, right? Because like otherwise, how would I keep using that gift if I didn't believe in, you'd have to just kind of dismiss the whole thing. So that's why I'd be curious, like, how do you do serving today? You can keep doing that, right? But you've disconnected it from your relationship with God.
Well, unless you interpret prophecy as speaking truth to power, in that case, you could have like a secular understanding of, you could say like Greta Thunberg is a prophet of today because of her activism on climate change. Yeah.
I get behind that. I like that.
Cool. Well, let's move on to the final question here. We've got this whole last section. Paul has a lot to say about concepts of love, forgiveness, retaliation. So I'm going to read verse 17, never pay back evil with more evil. Verse 18, do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Romans 12:20 is quoting Proverbs 25 here. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals of shame on their heads, which is an interesting turn of phrase that's kind of open to interpretation. Yeah, very, very loaded implications there. It's interesting. And then finally, verse 21, don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. So, like the list we were just talking about, this value of choosing love over hate, choosing forgiveness, choosing nonviolence even is something that I really resonate with. I think that's like a beautiful value that Christianity has and is sadly like doesn't seem to be embraced very widely. But it's something I really believe in. I really believe like that, if there is any way that we can get like peace on earth, this is how we have to get there, by choosing love over hate. And of course, I know that that's like hopelessly naive and it's not pragmatically attainable in the real world. When you can only talk this way for so long before someone just calls you like a dirty hippie who hasn't like seen enough, experienced enough of the hard side of life. So I should acknowledge I'm speaking from a place of privilege, right? I live a very comfortable middle class life. I'm not like living in a war torn country right now. But I'll just say, I wanted to ask you about this concept of nonviolence because I know it's something you're very passionate about as well, Jeremy. And in an earlier episode, you had mentioned if I didn't believe in Jesus, I would not believe in nonviolence anymore. So, I've been thinking about that for the past several weeks of, I agree Jesus very clearly taught nonviolence, but there's also non-Christians who are exemplars of nonviolence. Gandhi is probably the most famous example. And there's also a lot of Christians who, in my view, seem to be very pro-violence. Like we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of people who are very nationalistic, militaristic, a real celebration of gun culture within Christianity. So, yeah, why do you need Jesus to be nonviolent? That's my question for you.
Well, I think why we all need Jesus to be nonviolent is because the world is violent. And I totally agree with you. probably nothing I believe gets more mocked and made fun of than this. And I mostly get made fun of it by Christians who look at me like, yeah, how cute for you that you think that this could be possible, or, that the world will work like this. To clarify, I said, because I definitely piqued your interest with that line that I said the other day, because it's brought up numerous times. I'm not saying if I didn't believe in Jesus, I would go back to violence now. What I'm saying is, and this is the point I was trying to make, I never would have got to a nonviolent point of view outside of Jesus. Like, it was Jesus that got me there. That's how I changed my mind on the thing. So it wasn't because I read something Gandhi wrote and it was so moving to me, although I'm sure that could have happened. It was because I studied Jesus. And in particular, I think about like Matthew 5, and I want to read verses 43 through 48. This is what Jesus teaches that I think literally is the most perhaps ignored thing that Jesus taught, but also the most life-changing if Christians were to take this literally. Matthew 5:43 says, "You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven." Basically, this is how our family operates. "For he gives his sunlight, God, to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike." Meaning, karma is not real. There's no thing like that. "If you only love those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." Basically, you are to be like your dad when it comes to this. You should share the family values of this. This is how our family operates. I would just tell you, I'm so drawn to this. I'm so enamored with this. This is like literally life-altering, history-changing type stuff. And the sad reality, which you and I would quickly agree with, is that most Christians don't take this literally. And you would not conclude this would be inherently something Jesus taught if you watched many Christians today, right? Which absolutely is to the utter failure of the collective church that we have disregarded Jesus' words here. But I would just say this is what makes Jesus, one of the things that makes Jesus so fascinating to me and so compelling to me, and just draws me in of like, I don't see this anywhere else. Like, this is incredible how far Jesus takes this. And I remember, I think it was my last trip. I've been to Israel, I think 4 different times, something like that. And I remember my last one, we were in this meeting with a rabbi and listening to this rabbi talk. And, it's just, we weren't like trying to debate anything. It was just like understand, the Jewish point of view better than I did. And so listening to this rabbi explain things, and, we're just kind of asking questions. And I remember getting the sense as he was talking about like the future of Israel and all this, that he had no obligation that he had to love his enemies. Like, that was not a thing this rabbi believed. And it may sound dumb, but it was one of those like epiphanies for me. I was like, if all you go off of is the Old Testament, that's not a clear teaching, right? And you could say it's justified the opposite way, right? If you just use the Old Testament. It's really Jesus that is the game changer on this. And if you don't choose Jesus, right, which modern day Jews would say, no, that's not the Messiah, then you have no reason to say necessarily we're going to love our enemies, because why? Like, why would we believe that, And this is one of the ones I just go, this has got to be one of the most unique things about Christianity. And the saddest reality to me is that Christians are not known for this. And in fact, you referenced Gandhi. Gandhi once had this famous quote, "The only people on earth who do not see Christ and his teachings as nonviolent are Christians."
Yeah.
And that's like the most damnable statement about Christians. And it was Gandhi who's like, look, can you guys read Matthew 5? Like, you're the only ones who walk away and are convinced God wants you to have more guns. And somehow this has become all a part of the Christian culture today, in America. And I was at, I don't think what it was like, some new coffee company. And they're like, yeah, it's going to be amazing. It's, guns, God, and coffee, in no particular order. And I was like the fact that just seems like such a normal guns, God, and coffee, like I would go, one of those is inherently out of place, right? Like, and it's not the coffee or God. But it was said to me like they knew I was a Christian. Like, of course, you're going to automatically resonate with this idea because you're a Christian. Like, you must love guns. And I just hate that part of Christianity. Like, I hate that I get associated with, oh, you're a Christian? Like, of course, then you love guns like we love guns. It's like, no, I don't. Now, here's the weird part is I was raised with a love of guns, and I owned guns, and I've shared that story, and it was studying this passage where, someone just asked me to consider, like, what does it really mean to love your enemies? And can you love an enemy if you're willing to put a bullet in them? And it's like, no. If I'm willing to take your life, I'm literally living contrary to that. And so, I agree with you. I live in a very sheltered environment, so it's easy for me to say this. But, I got rid of my guns so that in the event that I was threatened and scared, I wouldn't even have them available to use anymore. Because I suspect in a moment of weakness, I would want to. And so all I know how to do is say, I believe this is something better. And I want that to be what I would choose in that moment. And I think this is a game changer. And the reality, the reason it's a game changer is because we live in a very violent world that thinks, Pax Romana is the idea of Roman peace. Rome only brought peace because Rome had a bigger army. And so that peace only worked as long as Rome's army was in control. And this is how most Christians think. We have peace today through America. Well, it's Pax Romana. It's only peace as long as our military is the strongest. It's not real peace, because all we're trying to say is we'll beat violence with bigger violence and more violence. And this is what Jesus said, like, that escalates violence. It doesn't, this is Romans 12 even. Like, we're not fighting evil with evil. We're fighting evil with good. There's something different. And so this is where I would say, Christians, this is our chance to change the way we think. Let's try to literally take Jesus seriously in Matthew 5 here and go, hey, I think this is going to make sense. And this will play a ton into Romans 13 next week. So I'm very passionate about this. If you can figure this out, I think we've missed it on this one.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. I'm passionate about it too. Totally agree. Like, when the idea of, like, do not repay evil with evil, it makes me think of the debate we have around mass shootings. In this country, we have a huge problem with the gun culture in this country. And we have so many people who are making the argument saying the only solution to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And then there's other people who are making the argument that I think the best thing we can do is have as little guns as possible. And most of those people, from what I've seen anecdotally, are not the Christians. So I guess that's just something that bothered me. Like, again, I 100% agree with you on the philosophy of turn the other cheek, love your enemies. This is the way we achieve peace. And yeah, I'm deeply disappointed in the fruit that I see within Christian culture. Like they say, like, you will know a tree by its fruits. I had this huge crisis about the evangelical culture's embrace of Trump in 2016. I was surprised by it. It didn't make any sense to me. I thought, like, this character seems so different from the character of Jesus. Why are people into that? And then eventually I got to the point where I was like, but those people who love Trump are way more Jesus-y than me. They've got Jesus on their bathroom wall. They've got Bible verses all over their home. They pray more than me. They read the Bible more than me. So, who am I to say that this is the way of Jesus and the moral majority is not? And I think that also translates to the gun culture that I see.
Well, and again, this goes back to, okay, so let's go to Romans 12 too. Let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. And then he goes on to say, bless those who persecute. This is all chapter 12, not in Matthew 5 anymore. This is all just our chapter today.
Yeah, it's fair game. Yeah.
Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do all you can to live in peace with everyone. Never take revenge. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. And then don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. Like, this is like Paul's literally now giving you a chance. Hey, change the way you think. Oh, now I'm going to show you how to do that. Like, we're going to love our enemies. That's how we're going to do it. And I think most Christians read this, are like, nah, I'm good. I'm going to put Bible verses on my wall instead. It's like, no. Like, Paul's literally giving you a way to change what you think. And you might go, well, what was Paul talking about? In verse 2, when he says, change the way I think about what? I don't know. Let's go on to see what he talks about right after that. You know what I mean? This is it.
But the conservative gun nuts could just preach the same thing to us, right? They could say, we need to change the way we think and buy more guns.
But I would say, show me that in the text.
Yeah, well, Old Testament at least, for sure. Okay.
So we're out of Romans now. This is a Romans podcast. Come on. You can't do that.
Another thing I wanted to just acknowledge, because this is something that I've held to for many years, and the two biggest kind of like recent historical moments that have really given me pause were when the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan and the current war in Ukraine that we're seeing right now. To take like Ukraine specifically, this is a case where people are just living. They go from just living their lives to being violently oppressed by a neighboring force, and this is where the whole nonviolence philosophy really challenges me, because who am I to say these people should just die in their home or just flee? Like, who am I to say they can't retaliate and defend their homeland? Yeah, I don't know. And I wonder if you would say like that's where Christianity has some kind of edge, because it promises people if they behave nonviolently, then they'll be rewarded in the afterlife or something like that. Because that's something that is the problem with nonviolence, is like it only really works if everyone agrees to it at the same time, and it seems like that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Here's the way I would say it: there is no guaranteed formula on any end of the spectrum. Okay, so here's an argument I get often. Oh, so someone breaks into your house, you've gotten rid of your guns, way to go. There's now no way you can defend your family. Okay, that's an argument I get a lot. To which I would say, no, you're assuming the only way I can defend my family is by trying to kill an intruder. I could try to stop them without killing them, right? I could try to use my words. I could invite the Holy Spirit to creatively come up with some other solution. Now, there's no guarantee. I absolutely agree with that. Like, there's no guarantee I may lose. Absolutely. But here's the kicker that we don't often point out. Let's say you're the guy that's got 20 guns and you're like, never going to happen to me. Okay, what if there are more intruders than there are of you and they outshoot you? The end result is exactly the same. Exactly the same. So you can't guarantee in that situation that you would for sure have the upper hand and you would shoot better than they could shoot. And they were, you couldn't guarantee that either. And so we have to acknowledge we live in a world where you cannot guarantee the outcome either way. Even if you say, I'm committed to violence, unless you always have the upper hand, which historically, no one always has the upper hand, right? That changes, that ebbs and flows. You can't guarantee it. And so I think what we're acknowledging on a deeper level, this is a massive insecurity we have as humans, that I would be vulnerable, my loved ones would be vulnerable, and there's something inside of us, like, I don't ever want to feel that kind of vulnerability. And the problem with it is there's no way you can escape it. There's none. Like, you could buy all the guns you want. You could have a stockade in your house. You cannot escape the fact that there could be something that could go wrong, that you wouldn't be able to, rise to the challenge and, take anything you want. Okay, so you versus a SWAT team comes in. It's like, Like, go any extreme and the outcome could be the same. You're betting on the fact that you think you could disarm someone, or you could, you could overpower them, and maybe you could. But I'm just saying, I think Jesus is offering us something different, and it doesn't mean it's going to work every time. And I think anyone committed to nonviolence has to acknowledge that. Like, I don't believe this because I think it's for sure going to win. it might not win. I just believe this is the only thing that's going to make the world better. And, Christians have been willing to die all throughout history. And I think one of the most, human things we could do is to acknowledge the vulnerability that exists and be real about it rather than pretending that we can have big enough guns to make it go away.
Again, I am in violent agreement with you on all of that, if you'll pardon the pun. Yeah, yes, violence only begets more violence. And I mean, we even see this with the presence of nuclear weapons, right? The fact that we're in this perpetual standoff because we have enough firepower to just wipe out the entire planet at any time, and you would think that would be enough to just say, like, okay, we tried violence, no more. This is not the right way to solve the world's problems. And then somehow humanity persisted and has found creative ways to perpetuate violent on the ground wars without resorting to nukes so that the fighting can continue.
Right.
Okay, so just one more thing I wanted to ask you. Have you studied Jainism or Jainism?
No.
Are you familiar with this religion? It's kind of a offshoot of Hinduism, predates Christianity by several thousand years. It's like the ultimate non-violent religion, I would say, in the sense that its participants, like, their number one tenet is commit no violence to any other living thing. So that obviously not hurting or killing other humans, but to the extent that, of course, they're vegetarian, they don't eat meat, but they also wear cloth over their faces so that they don't accidentally swallow any bugs. The particularly pious people will sweep the ground in front of them so they don't step on bugs or anything. So, in today's culture, it's a pretty niche kind of corner of, it's kind of an offshoot of Hinduism and Buddhism because they believe in reincarnation and all that. But anyway, just that to say, like, these types of things make me think that perhaps there are other, like, philosophies out there. Like, Jesus was not the first one to come up with this idea that we need to be nonviolent.
Okay. I did say he was the first one.
Okay. I guess, like, that, does that give you pause at all? Because I mean, that combined with the fact that we have so many violent Christians in the world, that doesn't give you pause or make you question, like, what's going on here?
No.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I don't know how else to say it to you. No, and I think Jesus is the most compelling version of it. I think Gandhi is also very compelling. It's like, but Jesus taught it, modeled it, died for us, and I think Jesus also happened to be God. So yeah, whatever religion, I don't know how you say it, whatever religion you said, yeah, I like that they're nonviolent. I don't want to go study them and go sweep bugs, like that. I would say, okay, maybe I like the spirit behind it, but that seems rather intense, Jesus is talking about how we treat people, and I think modeled it and sacrificed for people rather than retaliate, and that to me is really compelling.
It's compelling to me too. I guess it's maddening that, because Jesus is so popular. You know what I mean? Like, everybody loves Jesus. Even non-Christians love Jesus. But
there's a bazillion versions of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
There's the Hobby Lobby version that we love to talk about. That's the problem. Like, there's not many Matthew 5:43 versions of Jesus that are popular.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I'm going. I think we should take this part literal. Like, and I'm in a minority. I acknowledge, like, to the shame of Christianity, I'm in a minority there because most Christians would not agree with that.
One other thing, as I was thinking about the fact that the call for nonviolence is potentially a call for self-sacrifice, it brought me all the way back to verse 1 of Romans 12 of presenting your bodies as living sacrifices. Just another thought when I was thinking about, what are the implications of nonviolent resistance, whether for the sake of Christianity and you're, like, sacrificing yourself as a missionary or something, or some other political movement where you're committed to trying to get results without resorting to violence. So again, just to say something positive about it, I think Romans 12 has a lot of really great philosophy, a lot of really great ideas here. I guess I would argue they're not completely unique, but I think the fact that so many people love Jesus is a compelling reason why we should embrace this philosophy and see if we can get more people on board. But I don't know if it's going to happen.
Well, if someone does love Jesus and you can point them here, then I'm hopeful that you go, hey, let me tell you what he taught, like, and then you see him model it, like he lived it, right? And so I'm hopeful. And again, I changed my mind on this, so I know what it feels like to be a pro-violent Christian and think that that's the way the world works, and then to realize, yeah, that's not actually what Jesus was talking about. And so I've changed my mind, and I try to leave space for others wherever they're at. And again, most of my friends are not where I'm at. And, we can lovingly joke about, they'll say things like, well, I'm not where you are with the gun thing. And, always preface it with that. And it's like, yeah, it's not a condition of being my friend, but I'm still going to try to point you to this beautiful picture of Jesus that I see, and I think is a better way to live our lives. And I think it would make the world better.
I agree with you, Jeremy. I think that's the best way we have to make the world a better place. All right. Any other closing thoughts? Do you feel like we had a pretty peaceful discussion about nonviolence here?
I do. I mean, the hard part of this one is you and I do agree on this one. So this is part of our agreement.
Maybe we should get a pro-violence advocate on the show so they can pound us into submission.
Don't worry. I'll get lots of them when I post clips of this week online.
Oh, really? You think so?
Oh, I will get plenty of them telling me that this is laughable. And I've gotten the reaction enough to know. So fear not, my friend, those comments will be coming.
All right. Is this a prophecy? Is this going to come true?
I'm prophetically saying it.
All right. Well, enlightening discussion as always. Thanks, Jeremy. This is beautiful stuff we're talking about. I'll say it again. Whatever you believe, I think you could read Romans 12 and get a lot out of it.
It's good stuff.
Great chapter of the Bible. Yeah, good stuff. Put it on the wall in your place of work. See if you get any comments. All right. Well, thanks for listening. We'll be in Romans 13 next week. Jeremy will watch Pig at some point. We'll talk about that beautiful picture of nonviolence, and we'll all live in utopian harmony. See you then.